Mhm.
Okay, we're just waiting for people to join. So it's 7 o'clock. A very big welcome to everybody watching on Zoom this evening to our local Kenley local election hustings. Thank you for joining us. I just want to go through a few things with you before we get started, just to explain how things are going to work. So we have 4 candidates live here with us this evening. Some of them are candidates, some of them are representatives of candidates, but they will explain about that a little bit later. And they're just going to, each one of them, explain who they are and what they stand for to help each one of us make up our minds as we go to the election, to the polling stations next week. Then we're going to move into a series of panel questions where I'm going to ask each of the candidates 4 questions, and they're going to answer them from their own perspectives, from their own party's perspective. And then at the end, we're going to open up the floor for people who want to ask questions of the candidates. Now, you will notice that each one of you is muted, and I would ask each one of you to keep mute on. We would like to ask that people are respectful of the candidates and not interrupt them when they're speaking. You will be given a chance to ask your questions at the end. And I do want to say right from the very beginning that if people are not respectful, then we will remove them from the Zoom so that all of us can get the best experience from this. Because after all, that's what each one of us wants. We want to be able to hear from the candidates so that we can go away and carefully consider how we cast our vote next week. So if you want to ask a question at the end, and questions will only be at the end, then you need to click on the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom, and you need to indicate in the chat that you would like to ask a question. Perhaps you can even give a brief outline of what that question is. And then when it's time to do questions from the floor, you'll be given the opportunity to ask your question. Now, I want to add that we are trying to stick as close as we can to 90 minutes this evening. And so I apologize in advance if you don't get round to asking your question, because everybody's been asking lots of questions. Then I do apologize in advance. So I'm going to hand over straight away, and we're going to ask our first question. What do you see as the most important priorities for the people of Kenley, and how will you help deliver on these priorities? And I'm going to invite Councillor Stuart King first.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good evening, everyone. I'm Stuart King. I'm a Labour councillor in Croydon, and I'm also Deputy Leader of the Council. I'm standing in this evening for John Sailing, Labour's local by-election candidate for Kenley. John very regrettably cannot be here this evening due to a long-standing commitment that he's not been able to change, but he's very committed to the campaign and was very persuasive in encouraging me to stand in for him. Before I say a bit about John, can I just acknowledge the work of the former councillor, Steve O'Connell, who was stood down as Kenley's councillor. Yes, we were and are political opponents, but we've always been able to work together on many occasions, somewhat to the annoyance of some of our political colleagues, I suspect, who would prefer that we all see each other as nothing other than political enemies and adversaries. I think both Steve and I saw that didn't really get us very far. So we worked regularly and well together, and I wish Steve well in his retirement. Although his will be difficult shoes to fill, they must nonetheless be filled. So I want to explain to you why I believe that John Sailing is the right man to fill those shoes. Like many local residents, John moved to Kenley because he was attracted to the area by how quiet it is, how safe and green it is. The transport links into London are very good, as are the schools. Living as he does just off the Godstone Road, John is a local candidate and therefore would be a local councillor and believes passionately in Kenley's unique, warm and welcoming community. By day, John works for a trade union in a role that sees him dealing with casework and leading campaigns, both of which have given him very real experience of protecting people at work and building alliances to make life better for people. And these are skills that he thinks would serve him and you well if he's elected as your new councillor next week. John is registered visually impaired, so his start in life was a lot more challenging than would otherwise be the case for others like him who grew up in a very working class background, brought up by his mum in social housing. John knows the importance of having warm, safe and dry places to call home. And that's an important priority for him. As a resident and more recently as our Labour candidate, John's had many conversations about what would make Kenley even better as a place to live and bring up a family. And based on those conversations, John Saling has 3 commitments to offer you, the residents of Kenley. The first is addressing the long-standing local concerns about poor public transport accessibility in parts of the ward, specifically the role he would take in lobbying TfL for a bus route to serve the top part of Kenley. He also thinks that speeding is an issue in parts of Kenley, and John has supported and will campaign for measures to reduce speeding in our local roads. He welcomes the recent zebra crossing that the Labour Council installed outside Hayes School, and John would also like to see speeding elsewhere along Hayes Lane tackled, in particular the approach to the aerodrome. John's third sort of priority for the ward would be to work with residents to stop planning applications that he thinks and residents see as overdevelopment of a particular site. He's particularly concerned about the planning application that's currently live for the doctor's surgery and 27 flats that would be part of that development at 2 to 4 Kenley Lane. And it's exactly the sort of overdevelopment that John says he's going to stand alongside residents in opposing. The doctor's surgery application has over 300 objections, which will be taken into account when the decision on that application is taken. John's very concerned that proposals from the government that would radically overhaul the planning system will deny residents, like the 300 who submitted objections, and their local councillors, whoever you choose to elect next week, will deny them a say in many similar future applications. I think it's the government's proposals, I think, have been dubbed a developer's charter. And John is very concerned that the proposals mean that it would be the government in Whitehall, not the council in Croydon, that would decide new home building targets. He's concerned about the proposals for zones, which mean that properties would be classified into protected, renewal or growth, with growth areas seeing applications receiving automatic planning permission, so no say for residents or councillors. John's really concerned about this developer's charter and wants residents to think about using the by-election next week to send a very strong message to the government that they should scrap these dangerous and undemocratic plans. And if I could just finish, Nick, by saying that Kenley has a Conservative MP, has a Conservative member of the London Assembly, and both its councillors have been Conservative. Why put all your eggs in one basket? I'd encourage residents to think about lending their vote to local Kenley resident John Saling. The next elections that determine the future of the council aren't for another year, in May 2022. So why not give John your vote this year and try before you decide whether you want to buy for a full 4-year term next May. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to answering your questions later on. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Stuart. And I'm going to invite Ola now to answer the same question.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. And what a pleasant surprise when I saw your face pop up this evening. And it's such a shame John couldn't join us, but I'm glad you joined us this evening. And I really appreciate you actually acknowledging the great work that Steve O'Connell did as Kenley's councillor and our GLA member for Croydon and Sutton. So I really appreciate that. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ola Kolade. I'm the Conservative candidate for Kenley. I've lived in Croydon for over 17 years. I now live on Reedham Drive, just off Old Lodge Lane with my young family, my wife Fiona, our little 2-year-old daughter, Chloe, and I'm sure a lot of people can reflect and resonate on the challenges that comes with raising a 2-year-old. And obviously as a parent, I feel like I need to say this as well, as a parent, the adorable moments that do come with raising a 2-year-old. So that keeps me busy. I love, and I'm very, very passionate about Croydon. I've spent a significant part of my career on working on a youth and community development program called National Citizen Service. So I was responsible for managing the setup and the delivery of that program to about 4,000 young people across Surrey and pockets of South London, including Croydon. And that experience really gave me a good understanding of the youth sector. It gave me a really good understanding of the charity sector and some of the challenges in those sectors. And I'm really hoping that if I am lucky to be selected, I can use some of those skills that I've gained in over 7 years into the role of being a councillor. I'm also the chairman of Kenley Conservatives, and that experience has really given me, the exposure to working with Steve O'Connell and really just understanding the key issues that Kenley residents face, including key issues such as planning. And it's interesting that Stuart mentioned the Kenley Lane development. We also have the Valley Road, the 61 to 63 Valley Road submission that's just come in, and a lot of residents aren't necessarily happy about that. I'm sure we'll touch on planning later on this evening. But let's be honest. Let's call a spade a spade. Labour have been bad for Croydon. Let's be honest. And as an opposition party, we have tried and we have held them to account, but unfortunately they've not listened to us. I'm sure some people on the call will have read the report in the public interest, and for us that also shows that they weren't listening to their auditors, which is a shame. And I think more importantly, they've not been listening to you, the residents of Croydon, and a lot of the people I speak to, quite frankly, regardless of what political position they are quite fed up and really just want Labour out of Croydon. But in terms of becoming a Kenley councillor, my top 3 priorities. So my first priority would be to stand firm against Labour's drive to build flats all over Kenley, and I will oppose developments that are insensitive and out of character with the local plan and the local area. A second priority would be to protect our green spaces. As we all know, Kenley it's a beautiful area, a gateway to the green belt, and we benefit from a lot of open spaces, green spaces, and we need to ensure, and I will ensure, that I protect those green spaces. We know that this Labour administration in the past have moved to remove green belt protection from parts of the south of the borough, and that's what they do. So that protection needs to be put in place. And I think the third thing that I will prioritise is to make sure that we keep Kenley safe and we keep Kenley connected. So working with key stakeholders and key organisations like Kendra, our ward panels, to just ensure that Kenley has the right level of investment, the right level of resources, to make sure that the community, we bring back and we amplify that sense of community to ensure that we have community projects that are really supporting all residents of Kenley. So those if elected, those will be my top 3 priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ola. Next, I'm going to invite Peter Underwood on behalf of the Green Party.
Good evening. I'm here on behalf of Esther Sutton, who's your candidate for the council elections. I'm your candidate for the London Assembly election, so I'm standing to replace Steve O'Connell on that body, but Esther would be your candidate for the council. Unfortunately, she can't be here this evening. As those of you who know Esther know, she runs the Oval Tavern up in centre of Croydon, and if you run your own business you also realise that it all falls down to you to keep it going, and at the moment there's been some staffing issues, and so unfortunately Esther is tied to a cooker in the kitchen this evening cooking for all the guests at the pub. Those of you also know Esther know that she's thoroughly involved in Croydon through and through and has lived here virtually all her life. She's brought up her family here. She's involved not only in the pub, she's involved in Pub Watch, where it's bringing all the pubs together, and big events like Croydon Pride and the Pearly Festival, which she was also involved in helping. But I'm not here to put words into Esther's mouth, but I can talk to you about in terms of our green approach, which is a very different approach to politics to what you hear from a lot of the other parties. The first thing is we believe power comes from the bottom up, not from the top down. We don't believe we get elected to govern over you. Green Party politicians are elected to represent you. We don't have a whipping system like the other parties. We're not forced to toe party lines. All Green Party elected officials are free to represent the people they represent. They're not forced to vote just because the way their party tells them to. I can understand in Kenley there's been a big push for a directly elected mayor because the council doesn't listen to them. Ola's already mentioned it, but I'm hearing this through, and it doesn't matter whether it's Labour or Conservative councillors, they're not listening to the residents. Unfortunately, the two-party system we have in Croydon means those councillors spend more time fighting each other than they do fighting for residents. While I'm not a supporter of the directly elected mayor, I think it's a move in the wrong direction. I think we need a more democratic council. I can sympathise with that perspective that people just feel they're not being listened to. And that's why I'm standing as a candidate for the London Assembly, and I know Esther's standing as a candidate for the council here on that basis of we want to represent people. So in terms of this question, when asked, what do I think are the top 5 priorities? My first response is, that's for you to tell us what your top 5 priorities are. I actually think we want to sort of have those open lines of communication. There's very little transparency in what happens at Croydon Council. Most people don't feel connected to decisions. They feel that decisions are made behind closed doors. They don't have that information to be able to contribute, and they don't feel that their contributions are welcome. People raise petitions, people submit views on planning applications. It appears to have very little effect. And so in terms of us standing as your candidate, it's about being that advocate for you as residents in the council chamber, because we know the council's a mess. At the moment, the financial mess is a real problem, which the Conservatives voted for those budgets as well as Labour. So I feel it's a little hypocritical for some people to say they opposed it when they didn't. We need a fresh voice in there. At the moment, in the south of the borough, Conservatives rely on the fact that you're going to vote for them in the same way that in the north of the borough, Labour rely on people voting for them. We need to shake that up. We need to sort of stop people being taken for granted. One of the advantages of electing a Green councillor is that it sends a message to all the other councillors that if they don't buck their ideas up and actually start doing a better job, they're going to get voted out as well. If you just vote for another Conservative councillor in Kenley, as there has been for time immemorial, they will carry on. If you vote for the same old parties, you get the same old politics. It's time for a new start. It's time we actually had a change. We need something to change. And so that's why, as a Green Party, that's what we're standing for. We want to improve democracy so that you have more of an input into those decision making, and to stop the lazy system we have at the moment. So that's, well, we will talk through a number of issues. I know Nick sent out some of the questions already, so we'll cover those in more detail later, but that's enough for me for now.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to ask next Adrian Glendinning, who's going to speak on behalf of the Liberal Democrats.
Yes, hello everybody. My name's Adrian. I'm standing, as mentioned, as the Liberal Democrat candidate for Kenley. I've lived in Croydon now for 21 years, and like most people, I moved to Croydon from I moved to Kenley from central Croydon for the green spaces, for schools, and good links into Croydon and London. And I think personally, my view is that Kenley needs a little bit more housing development. I think we've got to recognise the need for affordable housing, because not everyone that lives in Kenley is of retirement age or of middle age. There are young people that will need to eventually get on the housing ladder, and if we don't provide affordable housing, then they're going to move out of the area and Kenley will die. As well as that, I think a very, very important thing is the accessibility. At the moment, the bus routes kind of just go round the outside of the ward, and there must be some way that we need to improve that bus service so that we've got a bus service that goes through the middle of the ward. In the same way, I think we need to develop all the area around Hayes Lane so that Kenley has a kind of has a hub, if you like. There's room, I'm sure, for community buildings to be built so that we can provide resources for young people to meet and for older people to meet as well. And there's enough money in the plan that's been put forward to accomplish all those things. We don't need any vanity projects that Croydon Council have been spending vast amounts of money on, both the Tories and Labour. And I would, I'm quite new to this. I've only just recently retired. Well, actually, I'll retire tomorrow. So I'm going to have a lot more time to devote my time to local council issues. There must be some way that we can kind of give Kenley a more of a hub, if you like. Croydon's got its centre. Kenley hasn't really got its centre. And I think it would be nice if some of the money and the plans that have been put forward, right, in the plan, can centre on that. I think we need to deliver more of the council services that have been promised by the Croydon Council itself, and devote a few more of those resources to Kenley. What we need to do is that plan. We need to think about what can any development plan do for Kenley, rather than what Kenley can do for Croydon. So I'm just going to summarise. As I said, I'm quite new to all this. Most of the people that we've heard before me are quite astute at putting their views across. As I said, I'm quite new to all of this. I would like to think that myself and the Liberal Democrats as well would put a new voice in Kenley and a new voice for Croydon. So obviously we'd have to work with the rest of the parties in the council to deliver social services and everything else that we need to do to make Kenley a more, I believe, in a better place to live than it already is. And that's me.
Great, thank you very much, Adrian. There is, of course, one more candidate who will be on your papers next week, and that is Zachary Stilling, and he is standing for the Heritage Party. Unfortunately, Zachary is not able to be with us this evening and doesn't have access to the technology to be able to join us on Zoom. So he has asked me to read his statement on his behalf. He says this: "My grateful thanks to Nick Graves for agreeing to speak on my behalf tonight. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you in person, but digital technology does not play a large part in my life. My computer is too basic to allow me to take part in a Zoom meeting. If I may take a minute to introduce myself and the Heritage Party. The party was founded in May 2020 by London Assembly member David Curtin. We are a socially conservative party founded to champion civil liberties and traditional family values. On a national level, we oppose lockdowns, vaccine passports, and woke cancel culture, and promote freedom of speech, free markets, and individual responsibility. I'm entering politics after 5 years as a freelance journalist and historian, and have lived in Croydon all my life. I am a conservationist at heart, having been actively involved with the preservation of historic vehicles for several years, and I am equally passionate about preserving historic architecture and the countryside. I have developed an affection for the rich history of the borough, which I believe is to be celebrated, and I'm committed to seeing it prosper in the future. I believe that the rapid construction of high density, low quality housing is one of the greatest threats Kenley faces, along with the council's cavalier disregard for the green belt. Housing developments are typically constructed at the expense of green space, historic buildings, or community venues. I will address this matter in full shortly, but suffice to say that I am wholeheartedly committed to protecting Kenley's countryside, historic buildings, and community facilities, and I will object to all developments that do not meet the highest of standards. Often in winter, Kenley suffers from severe flooding, a problem which, incidentally, is likely to increase with more housing, as more hard standing will prevent water infiltrating the soil and lead to surface runoff into the valleys. Croydon Council was unable to fulfil its planned flood prevention measures as a result of its bankruptcy in November. Now that the council has been bailed out by the government with £120 million, I will make flood prevention and infrastructure improvements in Kenley a priority. I am also conscious that many workers in Kenley, especially small business owners and those working in hospitality, will have suffered severe financial damage because of the lockdown. In 2016, the council gave £4 million to Box Park, despite local business owners' fears that it would damage their trade. Local independent businesses play a much more important role in a community than national and transnational corporations, and I will see that they are prioritised for grants and loans. That was the statement from the Heritage Party. All right, so we've had our opening statements. Now we're going to move into a panel discussion, and we're going to ask the first question. The first question is this: many people in Kenley are concerned about a rising housing development in Kenley. How do you respond to these concerns? And if elected, what would you do? And I will put that question first to Ola.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Nick. And you know, it's a very pertinent question. As a local candidate, I've seen first-hand experience, and I've had first-hand experience of the impact of overdevelopment in Kenley, and also working with the existing Kenley councillors. You know, a significant amount of their casework are objections on insensitive developments that are being pushed through by this Labour administration, and I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with that. And to be quite clear, that we are not opposed to housing. We do need more housing, but it has to be the right amount. It has to be good quality housing, and in the right areas. And I think most importantly, it needs to be done in consultation with local people. And I'm sure most of us can attest to the fact that Labour are currently demolishing too many good quality family homes and building one-bed blocks of flats. And once again, there's nothing wrong with flats, but these developments need to have the right infrastructure to support the right level of housing. And we know that what this is resulting in is a pressure on our services, a pressure on our roads, a pressure on our parking, and quite frankly, from my personal opinion, this is one of the reasons why the DMOC referendum is happening, because this Labour administration are not listening to local people. They have a plan to build 2,000 new homes in Kenley. Anyone who lives in Kenley knows that that's way too much houses, new homes for Kenley. and you know, they've ignored us on when we challenge them on these types of issues. They've ignored residents associations like Kendra, and quite frankly, they are not listening. And we know that, you know, the only way to really stop this happening is to vote Conservative and have a change in administration. And if elected, I will be protecting Kenley from overdevelopment. I just think we need to listen to local people, come up with creative housing solutions that do not destroy the character and spirit of Kenley.
Thank you, Ola. Peter.
I think the first thing, I completely sympathise with people's worries about the housing overdevelopment. I know I was involved with the campaign. Well, I spoke to people in the campaign on Wamford Road Green when there were brick by brick plans to build all over that. There's a lot of overdevelopment put forward for Kenley, particularly on green spaces, which, as you'd not be surprised to know, somebody in the Green Party, we're completely against building on green spaces, whether that's brick by brick currently, or when the Conservatives built all over Cane Hill, which was green belt before they gave it away. So if you want, there is a party you can trust to defend the green spaces, that's the Green Party. In terms of housing, we need to look again at those whole figures, because there isn't a housing crisis, there's an affordability crisis. There's more rooms per person in London now than there's ever been. It's not that we have a shortage of housing, it's the wrong type of housing, or it's in the wrong hands. There's a lot of empty properties that have been bought up as investment opportunities rather than as homes. Similarly, in Croydon at the moment, we're seeing a lot of small flats built rather than family homes. But part of the problem with that is the Conservative government have ripped out all of the controls over planning processes, which Labour in Croydon haven't helped by pushing through with brick by brick. And the combination of the two means we end up with lots of small flats, I say, that are just bought up as investments rather than actually the housing we really need. And so we need to actually focus on that housing need and not building unaffordable flats that the people who really need housing can't access. So we need to build housing for rent is one of the key things, not housing for people to buy, because most people who are desperate for housing can't afford deposits, they can't afford to get on the housing ladder. So we need to focus on the people who really need it. So yes, I have full sympathy with people in Kenley, and obviously we will be backing them in preventing the massive overdevelopment, the concrete overing of gardens as well as green spaces, because that's one of the things that's happening with big houses being knocked down and then all the gardens having flats built all over them. That's equally a loss of green space, which leads to the flooding problems that one of the other candidates mentioned earlier.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Adrian.
Yeah, so regarding there's obviously housing is a big issue. We would never ever agree to any building on any greenbelt land. We'd have to look at every application on its own merits. Where there's got to be the right developments in the right place and at the right cost. And as well as that, everything must be backed up with providing the necessary infrastructures. So, you know, we've got to provide for additional schools, certainly additional shops, providing maybe local hopper buses so that people can get to these, you know, they can get to Kenley Station, they can get to the shops, they can get to the airfield so they can have some fresh air. GP surgeries. I mean, there's only one GP surgeries in the whole of Kenley and one pharmacy. Now, obviously, we have to provide housing for the kids that are coming along in the next generation. And that means those houses have got to be affordable. And as I agree with the majority of the candidates that have been speaking earlier, you know, it has to be the right place at the right time and at the right price. And that's certainly our views on planning.
Great, thank you. Sorry, are you finished, Adrian? Yeah. Okay, no, thank you. All right, and Stuart.
Thank you, Nick. I'll try and engage directly with the question and resist the temptation to come back on one or two of the points that Ola made. Look, the concerns that residents have about particular developments and development in general, I think are by and large legitimate, but they're not always valid. So sometimes residents have concerns that, by valid, what I mean is a planning authority, whether it's councillors, whether it's the planning department, that they can't take them into account. I mean, a particular one that I come across as a councillor is people saying, well, it's going to affect my, it's going to affect the value of my property. And that's simply not something that the council, any planning authority can take into consideration. But the broader set of concerns that are clearly evident in Kenley are legitimate. And I think the three that John has identified and that John Sailing sort of shares a concern about is overdevelopment of individual sites, where where the developer is trying to get too many homes on a site that's too small for that scale of development, where the development itself is out of character with with neighbouring properties, and either the individual implications for local infrastructure of a site or the general cumulative impact on infrastructure. The second part of the question says how, if elected, would John Sailing work to address those points. John's very clear that he wants to work as a local councillor with residents, with the Residents Association, so with Kendra, also with the recently formed Kenley Community Steering Group, which was involved in looking at the community plan, and he's also keen to work directly with developers. If that helps convey through his role as your elected councillor local sentiment and feeling, because I think that some developments can be stopped or can be improved if there's a much better level of engagement between the developer and local residents, so that they can understand what is acceptable, what would be acceptable, and what isn't, and what the particular problems are. John would seek to do this on a scheme by scheme basis, so as developments come forward, but also what he would be looking to do is play his role as an elected ward councillor in shaping the new emerging local plan in Croydon, which none of the other candidates have mentioned yet. But I think that as he sees it, is an important tool to try and build in better protections to ensure that the homes that do come forward are appropriate and sensitive to the needs of local residents. Thank you, Nick.
Great, thank you, Stuart. I do have written statements from the Heritage Party, but they are extremely long. So if anybody would like to get a copy of those statements from the Heritage Party, then please do get in touch and I will gladly send them to you. We're going to move on to our second question. Croydon Council have stated that they face a £64.2 million gap in funding this year, and that this inevitably means cuts to services. What do you consider are vital services in this community, and how will you ensure that these services are retained? And I'm going to pose that question first to Peter.
I think with all of the cuts to public services that have gone on over recent years, everything we have left is vital, because we are down to the bare bones of public services. So I think we need to fight tooth and nail to keep hold of everything we've got, and we should actually be investing far more in public services. The government have cut funding to councils, for Croydon Council, by 75% in the last 10 years. So there's a huge gap in the funding needed to keep council running. There's also issues about how the council finances have been managed. In Lambeth, where I know we have some Green councillors there, a group of people have conducted what they call a people's audit where independent people who aren't party politically related outside of the council have gone through the council's figures and found huge areas where money could be redirected from where it's being wasted at the moment. I think we need to do that in Croydon. There isn't transparency in the figures. I've had a look through the accounts. The consultation on the bailout was so untransparent. It was opaque, that's the word I'm thinking of. It was impossible for us as outsiders to actually work out what's going on with this money. So we need a proper people's audit where these figures are looked at properly. But even from those figures, one of the issues, I was at a meeting last night talking about the threat to close 5 libraries because it was decided that £500,000 had to be cut from the library's budget. Why that was decided was no explanation was given, and why a permanent closure of libraries was seen as a sensible solution to a temporary financial problem, equally I never understood. But if you look at the figures, the one thing that hasn't been cut in the council finances are the high salaries of the senior managers, and the 15% cut that was applied to libraries. If you apply the 15% cut to salaries for people earning over £80,000, you save far more than £500,000. So why couldn't they have a short-term cut to their very high salaries for the sake of saving public services for the rest of us and saving other people's jobs in the council? You could sort of, from saving those salaries, you could save 40 to 50 other people's jobs who work for the council who are only earning 20, 23,000, which a lot of the frontline staff are. So I think what we need to do is, yeah, complete fresh start look at the council's finances. The problems have been caused in the past, partly because councillors didn't know what they were doing, but also senior managers didn't know what they're doing. My background was in the civil service. I worked in central government for 17.5 years. I've also worked in the European Parliament. I know that from what I've seen of these finances, that the budgets are just all over the place. They need proper looking at. And so, yes, we need more funding from central government, but we also need a serious look at what's going on in Croydon, because this throwaway ideas of just cutting services means, as far as I can see, the whole system hasn't been looked at properly, where we could save money from things we shouldn't be spending money on and actually keep the services, the vital services that we need for people in the community.
Thank you, Peter. Adrian.
Yes, regarding the cuts to services, I mean, obviously, in any civilized society, we've got to provide all the things that the vulnerable, the elderly, children, our current youth, all those things have to be retained. Any services to those areas have to be retained. And how would we deal with this? Well, we certainly wouldn't spend vast amounts of money on the vanity projects, as I mentioned a lot earlier, that the Conservatives and the Labour councils have been doing. And how would we achieve this? I think it's just got to be better budgeting. Certainly, as a Lib Dem councillor, I'd be looking at every penny that the council spends, and going through it with a fine tooth comb. I mean, I'm a finance manager. I've just recently finished working for a company that provide care and key working for vulnerable kids. So I know, from that background, I know exactly that every single penny counts and nothing can be wasted. So that's in a nutshell. It's just better budgeting.
All right, thank you, Adrian. Stuart.
Nick, again, sort of trying not to get drawn too much on the criticisms of the council, and instead addressing the question in particular. And by the way, I'm more than happy to answer questions about the council, but I see my role here not to speak to my role in the council, but on behalf of John, as a local Kenley resident who wants you to think about voting for him to be your local councillor. Look, everyone sees the services they use as vital, whatever those services are. So everything that the council does that people are using, people are going to see as essential for them. For John, the vital services are very often hidden they're not delivered in a public building necessarily. So whether they happen, how well they happen, and how they are delivered isn't often seen by anyone other than the individual person, the family receiving them. I think there's probably a reasonable chance that most people would agree with John that the services the council provides in terms of social care for vulnerable adults and vulnerable children and young people are the truly vital services that need to be protected. They're certainly the services that John would want to see protected, and they may be services that some of you on this call use or have family members that use and rely on. So how can they be retained when the council's got to make huge savings? And I'm afraid the huge level of savings that the question identifies aren't going to be saved by looking at top executive salaries or some of these other things that are very easy things for people to suggest. But in reality, we are going to have to do it because our adult and children's social care costs are outliers in London. So we spend more on those services than other London authorities do, without necessarily getting the right or the very best kind of outcome for that spend. And so we, as a council, and John recognises this and would want to make sure this continues, are looking at how the council can reduce the cost of its adult and children's social care services to the London average. That doesn't involve reducing the numbers necessarily who access those services, but it's about reducing the overall cost by being more efficient and effective in the way the council procures those services, manages them, and delivers the outcomes that's expected. So that is how John sees that those vital services can be retained, even in the context of a council that's got the unenviable task of needing to make significant savings. And the final point that John would like to get across to you is that he would also use his role as a kind of community councillor to ensure that he understands how people are finding those services. So whether that's by working with the voluntary sector in the ward, whether it's about maintaining good relations with faith groups and others who are involved in working with vulnerable service users, and indeed the regular counsellors' surgeries that John would hold that would allow him to talk directly to people in the ward accessing those services. So thank you for the chance to answer that question, Nick.
Thank you, Stuart. Ola.
Thanks. And just to pick up on Peter's point on financial management and financial transparency, which I think is the key issue here. If I can refer to the report in the public interest, which highlights that every council has had to make, tough financial decisions. This is what we elect councillors to do. So I don't think it's fair that this can be used as an excuse. And whilst the former council leader has stepped down, this huge gap still remains. And this, unfortunately, as some of the other candidates have mentioned, will impact some of the most vulnerable people in our community. And to put our financial situation into a little bit more context, Labour have borrowed £15,000 of debt every hour since they took over in 2014. And most people know and understand that there's nothing wrong with borrowing. In fact, most of us borrow to buy our homes. But what's wrong is reckless borrowing and reckless spending. Labour gambled recklessly on brick by brick. They bought hotels and shopping arcades that have now gone bankrupt. And this gap is a result of incompetent decisions. And to touch on the services that need protecting, as we've said, all services need protecting. We need to protect housing for vulnerable residents. We've seen the coverage of Regina Road in South Norwood, as someone who's spent a significant part of my life growing up in Croydon. That was very shameful, in my opinion. We need to protect vital services like our children's services and our adult social care. You know, we know this administration is just recovering from that negative Ofsted report that we had in 2017. As someone who's worked in the youth sector, I know how important these services are to our communities, and we also need to keep our communities clean. So ensuring that our waste, our bins being collected, our environmental services aren't disrupted as a result of Labour's incompetence. These are key issues that I will be advocating for, and we really need to look at how, going into next year, how we ensure that we have a change in administration, because this just can't carry on.
Thank you, Ola. Is that everybody answered that question? Yeah. Okay, so second question is this. The Kenley Community Plan was successful in a bid for GLA funding to deliver projects that connect and improve Kenley. What new and existing projects do you think will connect and improve Kenley? And I'll put that question to Ola.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, I think Stuart mentioned that no one had mentioned this before, but you know, I personally welcome the £800,000 commitment from the Good Growth Fund, and I'll start by saying that we need more, and I'll be pushing for more. But I think this gives us a good foundation to start from. And I think we really have a great opportunity to look at how we support local businesses in Kenley. You know, we need to look at how we improve mobility, to be candid, around Kenley. But one of the things I'm really passionate about is, you know, the use of community projects. So say, for example, as someone who plays sports, I know the impact you know, playing sports has on my health, my well-being, my networking opportunities, being able to connect with people I normally wouldn't connect with. So I'll be quite keen to explore, you know, how we can use you know, the New Valley Primary School field outside of school hours, you know, for community outreach sport projects. You know, I'm aware of similar projects in Croydon that use sports as a means to coach and mentor young people who are at risk, you know, young people who are not in training or employment or education, to help with their future prospects and aspirations. But I personally think that whatever we decide has to be community driven. The voice of local people has to be put in it, and using my experience of setting up and delivering community projects and stakeholder management, if elected, I will hope to work with the Kenley Community Steering Group and other, you know, key stakeholders to ensure that all projects involve that community voice, that all projects are good quality and all projects are delivered on time and delivered within budget. And that's what I hope to do.
Thank you. Stuart.
Thank you, Nick. John's when I spoke to him about this question, he said in respect of, because the question asked about existing projects as well as any new ones, and on the existing projects, I mean, firstly, like Ola, he's very pleased that the council, working with the community, has been able to secure this Good Growth Fund money, because I think it is, in its broadest sense, an important part of trying to marry, you know, the development and the consequences of it, and how you kind of ensure infrastructure is put in place to respond to that. He's very supportive of the proposals to improve the public realm at the 2 shopping parades, the proposals for additional electric vehicle charging points, given that they're, you know, even the government recognises that there is a need to move away from petrol and diesel towards electric vehicles. I think by 2030 there'll be no new petrol or diesel vehicles sold. So improving the infrastructure for electric vehicle charging points is going to be important. But actually not just for people using vehicles, for people using their feet, you know, pedestrians. That is something that he is very keen to ensure that people who by choice or by necessity get around on foot, that they can do so in a safe way. The proposed refurbishment of Kenley Memorial Hall and Old Lodge Lane Baptist Church, if I'm allowed to say that, Nick, are 2 particular projects that he welcomes. In terms of new things, I think the principal objective that he's got, if he's elected, is to help secure a bus route that is going to increase people's ability and connectivity in Kenley, and he's absolutely kind of committed to working with fellow councillors of both parties, residents and others, to ensure that a bus service is eventually introduced into Kenley. And one final thing that I know he's very keen on is street trees. Just looking at where there aren't enough trees in some roads, introducing those. They're a really good way of tackling air pollution, but they're also, if you wander down streets, mine in particular at the moment, it's got all the cherry blossom out. It just makes for a nice environment for people to live in, and the more street trees that he can see planted in Kenley, he thinks the better.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. Adrian.
Hello there. It just been mentioned about better transport. I think I brought that up right at the beginning of my introduction. It would be obviously very difficult. The problem we've got in Kenley is that you know, half of us are down in the valley and the other half of us are on the top of the hill, and some of the roads that are linking all these things, right, are quite narrow, which means that, you know, you've got to think about what type of transport you're going to introduce, so to bring everyone together. And our view is that hopper buses, little small hopper buses, might be the way forward, so that we can bring everyone together and develop community hubs in various places, like the Lodge Lane area and around Hayes School. There is probably enough room there to establish a community hub there, with more shops and perhaps an additional GP surgery, because the only other one is actually on the Godstone Road. And as well as that, it's been mentioned about the Kenley Memorial Hall. I mean, I think I've been to Kenley Memorial Hall probably 3 or 4 times in the 21 years I've been living in Kenley, and that was to jumble sales. And the number of times I've driven past there of a weekend when it looks as if the whole place is boarded up. There's an asset there. There's a local asset there, which I think we should be using, whether that be youth clubs and various other kind of senior citizen clubs and what have you. That would provide a community hub for everybody. And also, of course, Steve O'Connell closed the local police station and moved it up to New Addington. So we're not actually covered in any way with any kind of policing in the area. Perhaps that we should be using this again as a community hub for our young people and old people and what have you. There's a building sitting there, as far as I know, doing nothing. And why not use some of this community plan, right, to regenerate that and provide another place where everyone can go. But again, it's transport is an issue, right? It's a big issue, and I think hopper buses and things like that are the way forward. And I agree with Stuart about the bit about trees. Trees are good for you. I mean, I've got a cherry tree outside my house in Hillcrest Road, and all around my neck of the woods in Kenley, there are trees everywhere. There's no reason why not we can't plant a few trees on Godstone Road, just to make the area look a little bit more friendly and less commercial. And yeah, that's my views.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. I could just move people along just a little bit quickly, because we want to leave time for people to ask questions.
I'll speak more quickly, then I'll rattle through some stuff. I've been looking at this with my London Assembly hat on in terms of what's happening in outer London, particularly on transport issues, because places like Kenley, right on the edge of London, suffer from really bad public transport, both in terms of poor bus services. And so I agree with the comments that the others have made. We need to improve the bus services through Kenley. Also, being in zone 6 means that if you want to travel into London, you'd be paying £1,500 a year more than somebody who lives in zone 2. We have a flat rate on the bus service. Why don't we have a flat rate on the trains? So one of our green policies for London is to get rid of the zones so that people aren't punished for living on the outskirts of the same city. So we'd be looking at that. So that's connectivity to the rest of London. We're also looking at the concept of the 15-minute city, as it's known. This is something that's come particularly prevalent in the last year with COVID, where people have been focused much more on their local areas. And it's the idea that within 15 minutes travel by walking, cycling or public transport, you should be able to get to your doctor's surgery, your school, your shops, your services. And so that we put that energy that's been disappearing from local high streets back into local areas. So we have those small businesses, which is great for sort of people starting up businesses, but to be able to service their local community and people get to know their local shopkeepers and their local barbers and people like that, that you have all that in that area. It's a way of investing in the centre and giving people an investment themselves in their centre. One of the things I've noticed when I've been around Kenley is there's no cycle lanes. I know some of the hills would be a bit steep for some of us, probably be included, but in terms of encouraging more active travel, making the roads safer for people to cycle would make a big difference. It's another way of helping people get around, because as we know, 50% of people in Croydon can't afford a car, so it isn't just about cars. Lots of people need public transport, cycling, walking facilities. In terms of society as a connectivity, I think we need to build on one of the wonderful things, the dreadful tragedies that we've had in the coronavirus, but one of the wonderful things that came out with the COVID mutual aid societies, the work that's going on through Pearly Food Stop, if I give you a name check, Nick, it's sort of, there's some wonderful community things where people have come together to help each other out. And I think we need to capture that spirit to not let it disappear. Post Second World War, when people had gone through that dreadful situation, the idea of pulling together was how we built the welfare state on such a big scale. I think we need to sort of capture that spirit again as we're coming out of coronavirus, so that we do come together as communities and we come up with those solutions together and we build those community projects, the things that serve our communities. So yes, in terms of facilitating that, the work that's already gone on in terms of obtaining this grant is a good example of that. We need to keep that going, keep that community spirit going, and make sure everybody's involved in those decisions. It doesn't just become select groups, so that we have everybody, the whole community, involved in improving the community.
Thank you, Peter. And Ola, can I ask you to be as brief and concise as you can possibly be? Thank you.
Of course. So you know, some of the things I've already spoken about, and just to kind of expand on them, I also think that we need activities for our young people, activities that enable them to connect with each other, develop skills, improve their well-being, and also make them feel connected to Kenley. Croydon has a new legacy youth zone in the north of the borough. This was opened in 2019. They have really great facilities, and I know they're quite keen on arranging trips from young people from the south. So we need to think about how we actually connect residents in Kenley to other parts of the borough. And I think Adrian touched on the community accessible transport scheme, which was also mentioned in the Kenley community plan, and I think this is a good idea. I know Steve has been working on a new bus route to connect Brighton Road to Park Road, and I think this will definitely open up Kenley. But just talking on COVID, whilst the economic forecast as a response to COVID hasn't been as bad as we originally thought, we know that there's still a looming unemployment issue that we might need to contend with. And in Kenley, we do have a significant amount of employed people, self-employed people. About 80% of our residents have some type of work, and we can actually look at projects such as job coaching projects, which I currently run at my place of work, that connects experienced employed residents, or even maybe people who are retired, who have that employability experience, with some of our residents in Kenley who are not in education, who are not in employment, to try and level up some of that deprivation gap. So I think there's a lot of things that we can definitely do around transport. There's a lot of things we can do about community cohesion, and just to pick up on the cycling issue as well. I think that's a really, really good idea. Someone who cycles, I think we need more cycling in Kenley, but we also have to understand that, you know, there's about 26% of people in Kenley who are retired. We have a lot of hills, and, you know, we have a low public transport accessibility level in Kenley. So a lot of people still need to rely on cars. I think it's about 2.6 cars per household. So we do need to think about people who have to drive, who can't cycle. And on that as well, Sadiq Khan is looking to introduce outer London tax, which means that if you have a family friend in Whiteleaf and you want to visit them, or they want to visit you in Kenley, you're gonna have to pay an additional £5.50. And I think these are things, that key issues that we need to look at how we work with TfL, how we work with, hopefully, Neil Garrett, our GLA member, will be elected next week. But these are key issues that really affects people in Kenley. And as a councillor, as your councillor, these are key issues that I will be prioritising.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And we're just going to ask one more question of the panel. So if you want to ask a question after this next one, then please do highlight in the chat box that you wish to ask a question. And when they're done answering those questions, then Connor is going to be highlighting to us the people who want to ask questions. So now's your chance during this next question for you must highlight in the chat box that you want to ask a question. So our local youth and children's work providers PlayPlace have asked, within the youth sector, we are increasingly concerned about the lack of positive diversionary activities, poorer transport links, and an amplified sense of deprivation for small communities in the south of the borough. How might we best respond to this? And if I can ask all of the candidates to be as brief as they possibly can, because we do want to leave plenty of time for people to ask questions. So I'll go to Stuart.
Thank you, Nick. John thinks this is a really, really good question. So thank you to PlayPlace for posing it. For him, it speaks to his passion to challenge and address disadvantage in whatever form it might exist. I think the first, he's got 3 points to this, to his answer. The first is that he would challenge the notion that does exist of there being universal affluence in the south of the borough of Croydon. You know, it was a sort of fleeting reference to the fact that we got food banks operating in the south of the borough in this day and age. So I think one of the things that I think you could expect from John is that he would be a very strong voice in the town hall, challenging that notion and ensuring that where disadvantage exists in the ward, that he would be speaking up and looking constructively to find solutions to address it. I think the second is he would want to work both with the council, but also with the voluntary sector, and sort of going beyond that, working with schools in particular, with faith groups, to see how it might be possible to develop targeted interventions to address particular problems, whether they be geographic within the ward or certain type of disadvantage. You know, it could be about older people living alone, suffering, sort of social isolation. So there's a whole range of ways that John thinks that working with the community and the council, that kind of disadvantage can be addressed. And finally, leveraging external funds. I mean, the Good Growth Fund that was mentioned earlier is a really good example that John thinks that there's money out there, you know, whether it's the GLA, whether it's other organisations, charitable endeavours, that he could sort of get the council to work with the community to identify and bring funding in to tackle some of these problems. I hope that's sufficient to at least address the problem, but not too long to annoy you, Chair.
No, I'm just really keen that people get to ask their questions. Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate that. Ola.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my bread and butter. As I mentioned in my opening statement, that I spent 7 years of my life working on community projects with young people, and that's young people across different socio-economic backgrounds. So young people from independent schools, young people from people referral units, young people from state schools, and really getting them to connect with each other, but actually more importantly, getting them to connect with the local business in their area, the local charity in the area, and really actually getting them to understand what are the key issues in our area, getting that buy-in from a young age. And as they're doing that, they're obviously sort of building skills that they can use in their futures, in their future, whether it's in education or in employability. So I think there's an element of definitely working, carrying on the great work that's already being done, and actually looking at opportunities where other organizations, even businesses, might be able to support with. One of the organization I work with at the moment had a huge project about how do we respond to COVID, what impact has COVID had on young people's mental health. So we do know that there are challenges within the sector, but through cross collaboration of business support, the GLA, the council, key stakeholders in the community, it's about identifying those pockets of areas and young people that need the support and ensuring that we actually deliver rather than just talking.
Thank you very much indeed, Ola. Peter.
I think we're all agreed that we should be investing in the next generation. I think it's one of the most important things we should be doing. Unfortunately, this is one of the areas that's been hardest hit by the cuts over the last 10 years. We've lost hundreds of youth centres all over London, and huge cuts to that amount of funding for local councils as well. But this comes back as it's a good example, actually, of the sort of thing I was talking earlier. Sean Berry, who's one of our London Assembly members, Green Party London Assembly members, going through the Mayor's budget a couple of years ago, managed to identify millions of pounds of funding that hadn't been allocated and persuaded Sadiq Khan to invest that in youth services. Now that's a bit of cross-party working, it's working with Sadiq, but it is about going back to that point of trying to identify money and focusing it where it's really needed. Unfortunately, even those millions didn't make up for the cuts, but we need to sort of reverse those cuts in terms of getting money back into youth services. And I agree with the point that Ola made in terms of looking wider across the community. If we're not getting the money from central government that we should, then we have to involve community groups, we have to involve local businesses, because working with our young people is vital for the future. And they shouldn't have to bear the brunt of poor decisions being made at council or government or London level, because it's their future we're talking about. So we all need to work really hard to try and do the best for them.
Thank you very much, Peter. And finally, Adrian.
Yes, hello there. I think I've covered most of the issues regarding the young people in Kenley. Like Ola, I've worked for the last 4 years, organisation which provides support for vulnerable young kids and adults, and I think the key is bringing everyone together and having community hubs, making the best use of the assets that we've got. I've mentioned the Memorial Hall before. There has to be some way of bringing youth and older people together, right? And whilst it might not be the coolest thing to get on a hopper bus if you live on the top of the hill to maybe go down to the Memorial Hall, it's obviously going to be, it's the solution. The less traffic we have, the less cars we have on our roads. And people have talked about cycling. It's difficult nowadays to get kids on their bicycles because most of them are at home on their laptops. But nevertheless, it's all down to accessibility of the assets that we've got, right, and the transport infrastructure, if that can possibly be implemented.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Stuart, and thank you to all of our panelists, particularly in this last question. Thank you for keeping your answers short, because now I want to give everybody the opportunity to be able to ask the questions that you want. We are going to, unfortunately, we're going to overrun just a little bit. We're going to allow 20 minutes for people to ask their questions. So Martin, if you could pin Connor to the front, please. This is Connor. And Connor, do we have questions from people? And if you could highlight who they are, and then they can be pinned and ask the question themselves.
Yeah, we've got quite a few, which is great. I think the first one is probably from Jeff, my colleague from Kendra. His handle is Kendra Jeff. You want to pin him, please?
Okay, this is Jeff. The question is relatively simple. Do you support the proposal for a democratically elected mayor of Croydon? And do you think it's better or worse than the existing leadership model?
And is there anybody particular that you would like to answer that question first, Jeff?
No, not really. I think it's a reasonable question to all of them in that it's different.
All right, thank you. So, Ola, if you could be super brief so that we can give everybody a chance to ask their questions.
Absolutely, yes. Thanks for that question, Jeff. And very, very simply, absolutely yes. You know, Labour have not been listening to residents. As a party, we support the DMOC campaign. I personally supported the campaign. I went to the introductory sessions in Kenley and in Purley. So yes, we do support it. And yeah, I'll just keep it very simple. We absolutely do support it, and I support it as well.
Thank you. Peter?
No, I think it's a move in the wrong direction. We have a problem at the moment of the power being all in the hands of 2 or 3 people at the top of Labour. Putting the power in the hands of one person makes it even worse. An example of that is Bristol, where they do have a directly elected mayor. The first mayor they had was fantastic, consulted with lots of people, really involved the community. The last mayor they've had elected is basically a dictator for 4 years and does exactly what he wants and ignores everybody. So I don't think a directly elected mayor is the solution. I've written an article for Inside Croydon, if you want to look it up, which goes through what we need is a proportional system of elections so that the council reflects the way people vote in Croydon. At the moment, you get, for example, Labour having a majority of councillors, even though they got way less than 50% of the vote. So what we need is a proportionally elected system of the council so that if no single party has a majority, and that reflects the opinions of people in Croydon. So we actually need to move to a more democratic system of having a fairer representation rather than having a mayor that would never get over 50% of the vote, because none of them ever do in directly elected mayors. So you would always end up with a mayor that's elected by a minority. So no, I'm afraid I'm against the campaign.
Thank you, Peter. Adrian?
Yes, I mean, we understand everyone's concerns on this matter, but I've got to agree with Peter here that it's very undemocratic, and it's too much centralised power in one person. So it's the wrong decision, so far as we're concerned.
All right, thank you very much, Adrian. And finally, Stuart.
Thank you. So in preparing for this hustings, I had a relatively short amount of time to speak with John. We focused our time on the questions that had been prepared and submitted to us in advance, and obviously on his opening statement that I've read out. So I'm afraid I'm not aware what John's personal view on that is, so I can't give you his answer on that, but he is perfectly contactable, and I'm sure if you wanted to know, Jeff, where he personally stands, he can let you know. I don't think I've got a lot more to add to what Peter and Adrian have said, other than perhaps to kind of highlight, which I think most people would recognise, which is that a lot of what has fuelled the support for the DMOC campaign has been planning led, and it's been about residents' concerns about not feeling that they've been listened to on planning applications locally, and ultimately a directly elected mayor is going to, its decisions are still going to be taken by the same planning officials. The decisions are still going to be taken by a planning committee of locally elected councillors. And my worry is whatever outcome we get, that the supporters of the DMOC campaign are going to be somewhat let down when they find that actually the planning process is probably likely to operate very similar to the way it does at the moment, if indeed residents in October do decide that they want to move to an elected mayor model.
Okay. Has everybody answered? Ola, have you answered? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, Connor, who have we got next?
Sean, I think, was the next person in the list. We want to add him.
Sean isn't on video, so I'm unable to pin him up, so he can just
right. Okay.
Unmute and ask his question.
It's okay. I'm here now. Oh, my camera. Hi everyone. Yeah, I've just sort of been listening about. Obviously, a lot of money talk has been going on around and all this, but I've got a simple question to ask, because Labour Council has bankrupted Croydon, which is unheard of almost. So I don't know how they've even done that personally. The Conservative governing party of this nation has pretty much bankrupted the country. We're now £2 trillion in debt. You can't count to $1 trillion. That's how much that is. And the Lib Dems and Greens have all been complicit in shutting down businesses, ruining the economy, causing mass unemployment, getting us into debt that will never ever will pay back, and our children will have to pay for that. So my simple question is, apart from the Heritage Party, why should anyone ever trust you mainstream party guys again? So that's to all of the candidates, because I know Zach, the Heritage Party guy, can't answer these questions. He's not here, unfortunately. But why should anyone in this country ever trust Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, Green?
Okay, just before you answer that, if anybody does want to ask Zach any questions, then you can do that. And perhaps, Martin, perhaps you could put this in the chat. It's Z Stilling, ZSTILING @protonmail.com. And Zach will be very happy to answer any of your questions. So who would like to go first in answering Sean's question? Okay, Peter.
I refute the question to start off with, because the Green Party have not been complicit in that. The Green Party, we've stood against austerity right from the start because it's a nonsensical economic policy. Where we have Brighton Council, where we actually run the council, has just delivered a balanced budget where we are investing in public services. So if you want to see what we're doing, having a look at what we've just done in Brighton, where we found money to invest in tackling housing problems, improving housing, not just building housing, so improving social housing. So we have a track record of doing that. Caroline Lucas in Parliament, if you paid attention to what's going on in Parliament, has been a wonderful champion for people's voices in Parliament, speaking out against the nonsense, whether it's on Brexit, austerity, or the current lying that's going on in Parliament. The Green Party, it's part of what we are. We stand up for this, the honesty and the truth of what we do. And so that's a core part of what green politics is all about. And so, yes, as I refute the question, because we've not been complicit in the bad economics. And you can look at our record and the record of our councillors in terms of what we stand for.
Thank you. Anybody else want to say anything else about that? Ola, do you want to chip in there?
Yeah, I'll come in. And I think, thanks for your question, Sean. I think what I'd say in response is, the difference between where we find ourselves locally and where we find ourselves nationally, it's a little bit different. In Croydon, the situation could have been avoided. There's Conservative councillors, our Conservative councillors warned Labour, their auditors warned Labour, so that could have been avoided. But if we look at what's happening nationally, I think most people will appreciate that we've had a pandemic. We've had to spend huge amounts of money supporting small businesses, keeping the economy afloat. And I personally wouldn't apologise for that. And as I said earlier on, the economy, if you speak to experts, the outlook and the forecasts aren't actually as bad as we thought it would be, based on the fact that we've had to spend a lot, but this has supported the economy. If you think about furlough, for example, if furlough wasn't introduced, we would have had skyrocketed unemployment, poverty would have gone up, homelessness would have gone up. These key issues that we're concerned about. So I personally wouldn't apologise for the fact that nationally, we've had to have an economic response. that has saved lives, that have kept jobs. You know, in my place of work, you know, we've had to put people on furlough. So I think whilst I appreciate the fact that, you know, we live in a democracy and anyone can kind of, you don't have to vote Conservative. I would love for you to vote Conservative, but in response to the financial situation we find ourselves locally, that could have been avoided. Nationally, it's been a response that we've had to do, and I wouldn't apologise for that.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to give someone else an opportunity to ask another question. Connor, who do we have next?
Patty. I think Patty's raised some good points throughout, and so I think she'd like to ask a question.
Patty is on mute, and I can't pin her because she or he is not on a video.
Okay.
Okay. But I think while if we can get Patty back, then great. But Mike McConnell.
I'm unmuted now.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Yes, thank you, Nick, and thank you all candidates for laying out your stall. I am an advocate for the vulnerable. I work with people between the ages of 8 and 97. That's all across borough, and some have complex needs. I would like to draw everybody's attention to a white paper that was served by Tony Blair just after the death of baby Peter. And that particular paper said that all social services had to monetize each of their services. As a consequence, last year alone, local authorities across the UK made £219 million profit from taking children into care, and I haven't even got to the elderly. Recently, I have been in court of protection for some of the elderly, and what is happening is catastrophic. The way services are monetized is that
Patty, just for the sake of time, could you ask the question, please?
Yeah, right. The question is what do each of the candidates see as a priority in terms of providing services that people can actually access? Because talking up non-existent services, you know, on the front line is not working.
Okay, thank you. So, Stuart, I know you wanted to jump in on the last question. Apologies. Do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure the exact nature of the question. Sorry, Patty. What I'll do if I can is, I mean, I'll speak to the point that I made earlier about when I was talking about John's background. I mean, you know, John himself, as someone who's visually impaired, has experienced disadvantage and challenge that many haven't. That's shaped the nature of how he's lived his life and how he wants to help others overcome disadvantage. I'm absolutely confident, you know, having spoken to him a number of times and having known him a little, that, you know, as a locally elected councillor, he will be a very passionate advocate for many of those vulnerable people, Patty, that you work with right across that age spectrum. And that, you know, if there's something specific you'd like to talk to him about in relation to something in the ward that you're concerned about, I'm sure I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you. Adrian, did you want to jump in there? You're muted, Adrian.
I'm sorry about that. I've turned myself on now. Yeah, one of our key Lib Dem policies is to increase the carers allowances, so that the best people, you know, are providing the best care, and also another one of our policies is the need for a national care service similar to the NHS. And I'm afraid that's as far as my knowledge on this topic goes, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Adrian. Ola?
Well, I'll probably just first start off by saying that, you know, some people, most people are aware that Labour are cutting the welfare team. And to the question, this impacts, you know, the most vulnerable people who won't be getting the support as a result of Labour's poor financial planning. I've worked with, you know, vulnerable young people before, and as a councillor, it's obviously about, you know, supporting the teams, the hardworking teams in our councils who work with those young people. And to touch on some of the ideas that I've spoken about before, seeing how we can connect those organisations, those young people with organisations who do great work with, you know, developing their life aspirations, whether it's through boxing. You know, there's so many, you know, different organisations in Croydon and in London who work with those young people, and it's just really about connecting those young people to those opportunities and really building that relationship in a way that they can have a positive outlook to life, and they can have, you know, really good future prospects.
Thank you, Ola. Peter, do you have anything to add?
I think one of the things at the core of this is we need to return to the idea of public service. I'm a supporter of the NHS bill, which is about making sure the NHS remains a public service. And the work that the campaign have done on there have shown that's about £10 billion a year is wasted because of trying to apply private sector ideology into a public service. And money is lost through contracting and using private sector rather than it being operated far more efficiently as a public service. And those same principles apply across care services and all the other systems. So yes, I'm horrified by the idea of monetizing what should be a care service. So we should be it's the ethos of public service. These are publicly provided, and the purpose is to benefit people, not to make money, and not to have any sort of profit involved as an incentive in any part of the service, because that goes completely against what the services should be for.
Thank you very much. Connor, I think we've got time for 2 more questions.
Okay. So Mike McConnell, which is, I think, iPhone.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. My name's Mike McConnell. I'm the Kendra road steward for Rook Road, and I've been working very closely with Jeff James over the last couple of years, particularly in connection with the strategic side of things in Kenley area for transport and housing. And we spent a lot of time going into the consultant's report, producing all sorts of statistics to counter the report that was talking about 1,000 dwellings within an 800-metre radius of Kenley Station and things like that. But to date, we have still not really had any accountability and feedback from the council on this. So my question really to the various candidates would be, what techniques and tactics would you adopt in these joint meetings with the council to try to get more accountability coming into what's desperately needed in Kenley? Because if we don't get the big picture right, there's no point in just worrying about public realm issues or community halls. We're potentially heading for a gridlock in traffic at the moment.
Thank you. And is there anybody in particular that you'd like to pose that question to first?
I think it's an applicable question for everybody, if that's okay.
Okay, all right. Who would like to chip in there first? Peter, thank you.
Happy to go first. I think one of the planning issues, as Stuart mentioned earlier, one of the big problems on the horizon is the government's build strategy, where they're going to remove any controls on developers, and that will make it far more difficult for all of us to actually have any democratic say in what goes on, because the presumption will be in favour of development. So the first thing we need to do is unite against that and stop the government removing what few restrictions we have left. We need to fight to actually get those democratic controls back in. And I think I've been involved in lots of protest movements. I think harnessing that protesting movement, both against the developer, and it's not just the council, it's the developer who wants to build it. And I think targeting those companies and turning their activities into a bad PR exercise is a way of pushing back against that profit at all costs, regardless of residents. And I think so harnessing the unsurprising feeling of people in the community and just, you know, not standing for it. We've seen it work against road building projects in the past. Down at Balcombe, where they were going to drill for oil, the local residents, which were a mixture of from, you know, conservative older people right through to hairy hippies like I used to be in my younger days, coming together on a joint issue because we all care about it. And that's what—
Will you have the time and resources to actually do that yourself?
Well, that's the sort of thing that we would support as councillors. I mean, that's, you know, what as an elected councillor, that's what to do. And personally, I'm already involved in lots of different campaigns and organisations. I'm in fact active in Friends of the Earth, all of the voluntary work I do in the Green Party, plus other things. But it's about turning that, as a councillor, that's, for me, that's part of your job, is to actually put some time and effort into supporting residents in doing that sort of work.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Ola?
Yeah, and I guess to come to sort of Mike's question about tactics, I think, you know, we have seen some improvements to, if I think about Godstone Road Parade, in terms of the amendments that have happened there, and that's obviously come through TfL consultation over the past. We've seen that, just to touch on Peter's point, in terms of hearing that resident voice as well. DMOC, for example, we've spoken about DMOC today, and the reason why that was successful is because, you know, people across different political persuasions, so, you know, the Croydon South Labour Party support DMOC, we support DMOC, so there is an element of understanding and speaking to local residents, having that voice, that campaigning voice, to basically put your position forward. But, you know, we do have to work with the GLA candidate, and, you know, hopefully that's Neil Garrett, and from my personal experience, Steve has been really successful in that role, and he's been able to support Kenley with the Good Growth Fund and with other consultation with TfL. So it's really about that sort of stakeholder collaboration, working with residents, working with the council, working with, you know, as a councillor, working with the GLA candidate, and understanding obviously the different nuances with legislation and government policy as well.
Thanks very much.
Stuart, do you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, please. Ola's made a really good point there. I think that's probably worth expanding on. I mean, the Godstone Road improvements, I know a little about, because in my former cabinet role, I had responsibility for transport, and that was the area that I used to work very effectively with Steve O'Connell, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. And I think that's an example of the type of councillor you should be looking, I would suggest, to elect. Someone who is able to work across party divides. I would suggest you should shy away from a candidate for councillor who seems to use every question as a potential to make a partisan point. Look, we're all party politicians. I get that we have to kind of defend our side and attack the other side at times. But if it's all we do, if our purpose in the town hall is simply to be a party apparatchik and not a local resident standing up for neighbours, friends, local residents, then I think you're not going to elect a councillor who's going to be as effective in holding council staff and senior councillors to account. So I think, you know, choose wisely. Choose someone that you think.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And just a final chance, just for Adrian, just to chip in super briefly, if that's okay, Adrian.
Yes, I'll be brief. I mean, I must admit I haven't looked into the plan in as much detail as others might have done, but certainly I would make sure that my neighbours are happy with any improvements. At the present, I'm not sure what the transport solutions are, but I'm now, having just retired, I now have a lot more time to investigate and get together with everybody else to sort any problems out.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your question. Connor, we got time, we'll make time for one last question. Yeah. Who's this going to be?
It's from Lynn. She's not on camera.
Okay, thank you very much. It's all been really informative. Just a very straightforward question, really. If I chose to vote for you, would you guarantee that Purley swimming pool would remain open?
Oh, great question. Thank you, Lynn. So let's go to Ola.
So was that I missed that last bit? Was that about
Purley swimming pool? Would you guarantee that Purley swimming pool would remain open?
That's a really good question. You know, Stuart mentions making political points. You know, it's hard not to when, you know, we find ourselves in the situation that we find ourselves in. And, you know, as you might be aware, you know, our Purley councillors have worked with the community to campaign against Purley Pool shutting down. We are in a position where we are in, you know, opposition, and you know, those decisions lay with people like Stuart King, who's the deputy leader for the council. And you know, we do support keeping Purley Pool open. So it's just, as a Kenley councillor, obviously working with Purley councillors to ensure we can support the community to keep Purley Pool open.
Thank you, Ola. Adrian.
Yeah, yes, hello there. I'm afraid I can't guarantee, obviously, as a single councillor, anything or promise anything, but I would certainly look into the finances that are involved. You know, as a kid, my parents, in fact, my grandparents used to take me along to Darlington Civic Baths to learn to swim, and it's something that I do 2 or 3 times a week. Not at Purley, I must admit. I go to Oxted, but I mean, obviously, swimming's important. We live on an island, you know. We should all swim, but certainly it's something that, if it is a concern, if it's a concern to local residents, then I'll take up any issue. Yeah, swimming's important.
Thank you, Adrian. Stuart.
Thanks, Lynn, for your question. Purley Pool is in need of significant investment, and as a result, many people, like Adrian, choose to go to other swimming facilities. Many of them use nearby Wadden Leisure Centre. If the council, I mean, it's very easy, I think, to say, as Ola has, and indeed his Conservative council colleagues, to say, well, we're against this. They've opposed every saving that the council's made. That's fine. That's, you know, politics is about choices and priorities. What you should also be asking the answer to is, if you agree that Purley Leisure Centre and swimming pool should stay open, what would you cut to replace that saving? Because the council, and you as a councillor, if you're elected, have a legal responsibility to set a balanced budget. And the current budget is balanced. So if you take that saving out, you have a legal responsibility to replace it with something else. And I think 1 week before the election, honesty means, if you don't think the leisure centre should close, how would you make the saving so that people know that before they choose to vote for you next Thursday?
Thank you, Stuart. Peter?
Just quickly coming back on Stuart playing the Conservative game, it's not about one cut or another cut. We should be fighting against all cuts, and they are cuts, not savings. Who's saving money? It's just cuts. It's cuts in public services, and we should be fighting back against all of them, not playing the silly game of fighting one against the other, which unfortunately happens far too often in Croydon with North versus South. I agree with, as others said, as one councillor, me or Esther elected to think we couldn't on our own keep Purley Pool open. We obviously would want to keep Purley Pool opening because it's a vital community resource. One of my favourite school certificates is my 5-metre swimming with floats. It was the first certificate I ever got at school. So that sort of thing, it's important, say, for children coming through, but it's part of our public things. But yes, this is part of the larger battle to save public services from the cuts that are being imposed. It's not about fighting one thing against another. We should be pushing back against all of them.
Great, thank you very much. And I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you out there who've joined us this evening. I hope that you found this hustings helpful. I hope that as you've listened to lots of different perspectives, this gives you something to think about and to take away so that you feel more informed when you go to the polling station next week. I want to thank all of our panelists, Peter and Adrian and Ola and Stuart. Thank you for taking up the time to join us this evening. It's very, very much appreciated. I also want to give my thanks to Connor for helping me to get this Husting off the ground. Connor went knocking on people's doors and all sorts of things to make sure that we had as many panelists as we did this evening. So my thanks to him, but also my thanks to Martin at 9 Fruits, who have taken care of the technology this evening and have done all of the pinning and the muting and the booting, which I hope you haven't had to do. But guys, that's it for this evening. I know we've overrun a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that you were able to ask your questions. Tomorrow we will be posting a recording of this Zoom on the Old Lodge Lane Baptist Church YouTube feed. So if you want to go back and have a look, then please do so. But guys, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And we'll see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Nick. Cheers.
Thank you,
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night.